Over the past few years, I've been in two minds about creating this content. I'm from the camp that believes we need to make changes to reduce our CO2 emissions. However, I'm also a realist and believe that the current push for electrification will simply create more pollution, as well as a global revolution when millions of people are thrown into poverty. I know this sounds pretty extreme, but as the push to replace vehicles, insulate homes, replace heating systems, build more wind farms and so on is no longer a discussion but an immediate and extremely expensive reality, and one that the majority of the world's population cannot afford to make, then you can see that there is real urgency to ensure that the actions we take now are the right ones for our future. And if previous government schemes are like forcing people to buy diesel engine cars because they were apparently better for the environment or anything to go by, then we have serious problems on our hands. You'll likely be aware that there are 195 recognised fully independent countries in the world, with approximately, depending on who you ask, 209 countries in total. Of those, only 31 are developed countries. If we now take a look at pre-pandemic CO2 emission levels by country for a year, we can see who are the main CO2 contributors. Obviously, these stats are always changing, but they have been pretty consistent over the past few years, though set to vastly increase as of next year, which we will come to shortly. Of those countries in the top 10, we have China contributing 30.2%, the United States 14.5%, India 7.3%, Russia 7.8%, Japan 3.6%, Germany 2.2%, Canada 2%, Iran 1.9%, South Korea 1.7%, and Indonesia at 1.5%. So basically, the top 10 countries are contributing 70% of all emissions. China alone contributes the same amount of emissions as 199 countries. And China relies heavily on coal. 60% of their energy comes from the stuff, and as we have already seen over the past few years, with new power stations being built and due to be built because of the increase in power outages predominantly caused by global demand on China's manufacturing, this trajectory is only going to continue in an upward trend. And countries like India, though still in their infancy, are rapidly following in China's footsteps to manufacturing supremacy. And again, like China, India is heavily reliant on coal power stations. In fact, more so. Currently, 70% of their energy comes from coal. But we can't just point the finger at the likes of China, Japan or India, because when we look at CO2 emissions per capita, we can see that though many of the countries on the list have vastly smaller populations like Qatar, who have a population of approximately 2.7 million and a world CO2 impact of just 0.28%, we can quite easily miss the fact that per capita, Qatar are contributing more than any other country on the planet, at over 37 tonnes per person each year. Compare that to India, the third largest global contributor, with a population of over 1.3 billion, at under 2 tonnes per person per year. But before we start having a dig at these high polluters, another area that is not included in these statistics and seems to be rarely mentioned in the fight to cut CO2 emissions is war. The environmental impact from just these 9 countries alone is more than 1,000 countries worth of CO2. Just take that in for a second. 1,000 countries worth. The US alone creates the equivalent of 140 countries, followed very closely by the others on the list. And this bar chart only paints a piece of the bigger picture, as inevitably more are sadly at war. Another area which I'm possibly going to get some dislike from, which in my view is the main cause to the problem, leading to vast deforestation, food shortages, massive CO2 emissions from livestock, as well as displacing, making extinct and poisoning many of the wonderful creatures of this earth. Us, or rather overpopulation. As much as many of you may dislike to hear that or completely disagree with that statement, you have to accept the fact that there just isn't enough habitable land. We are running out of space and resources. So with that said, immediately we can see a huge global systemic infrastructural problem. Each country is different and has many of the same as well as many different needs. Normal CO2 is being calculated, and where we are reducing our carbon footprint in one location, we are simply shifting it to another. In fact, doubling it sometimes, even tripling along the way. Why double the amount, you may ask? Well, if, let's say, much of the world becomes electrified, the emissions saved will only be wiped out by the manufacturing, shipping and transporting of the new manufactured items, such as wind turbines, air or ground source heaters and pumps, and vehicles, and the transportation, scrapping and recycling of all the old vehicles, boilers, gas heating systems, you name it. What people forget to ask or add to the equation is, what are the CO2 emission implications of scrapping a car, for example, with its many different types of plastic, fabrics, oils, metals, rubbers, glass, and so on? And not all of these components can be recycled in the same countries. That's got to have a huge environmental impact, especially when on scale at pretty much the same time back to back for the next 10, 20, possibly even 30 years. And if you search online, you'll struggle to find anyone really talking about these issues, just like no one is really talking about the huge CO2 emissions from car tyres. They create up to 1,000 times more harmful pollutants than exhaust fumes, and electric vehicles, on average, use twice the number of tyres due to their additional weight and traction. This is another area that needs to be addressed before everyone commits to buying one. And then, will wind power be the answer when rising temperatures have already reduced wind levels across the globe by approximately 15% since the 1980s? And as we have seen in the UK, we are on the verge of shortages and blackouts because of this drop in wind power, which we are growing heavily reliant upon. Why aren't we considering nuclear energy instead? And who's going to pay for all of this? If we look at countries like the Ukraine, many of the people are already struggling to afford to heat their homes and instead chop down the 100-year-old trees in the parks and forests for firewood. Even if we look at developed countries like here in the UK and US, which have extremely similar average household savings, we can see from the average UK or US resident that they have approximately £6,800 in the bank. But obviously, even with that amount, it wouldn't be enough to either buy a new electric car, insulate every wall in the house, or install a new heating system. And this £6,800 looks vastly different when you remove the top 1% wealthiest from the list, which paints a stark picture. Roughly 1/3 of adults in the UK and US have savings of less than £600, with 1 in 10 residents owning nothing more than debts. Now, I could quite easily go on, as I have only scratched the surface, but for now I feel we have enough of an insight to see what the current state of affairs really is. It's a mess. So let's take a level-headed look at what the professionals are saying we need to do. According to the United Nations, at a bare minimum, we need to reduce global CO2 emissions by 7.6% year on year. I believe we can reduce CO2 by vastly more than this by simply making a few minor changes to our daily lives, our spending habits, travel habits, and even if every council, state or regional government around the world, for example, set their street lights to turn on an hour later and off an hour before they normally would, that alone would make a huge difference. And if as many governments can work together to reduce their wars and fighting, testing and manufacturing of military equipment and arms, it will not only reduce CO2 emissions enormously, it will also buy us the time we need to build the tools, discover the technologies and produce such things as hydrogen at an affordable price, as well as having the infrastructure in place to use renewable energies to extract that hydrogen. This way, we'll not have to replace entire vehicles but adapt a small part of the engine, and we won't have to spend tens of thousands replacing a heating system, either, as a simple 1-hour fix will convert a gas boiler to a hydrogen-powered one, therefore preventing the astronomical amount of CO2 wastage that would otherwise be produced by manufacturing items we just do not need and scrapping items we should never be replacing or scrapping. We all have a duty in helping to save our planet, but we need to come together and pull in our resources. Governments have to put their differences aside and work together. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We cannot muck this up. The rich and super rich have an extraordinary duty to invest in poorer countries' infrastructures, as well as helping to finance research and development into renewables and technologies. There are still places in this world where people don't even have fresh running water. Companies must start to make things that last and take on modular design, so that, for example, instead of upgrading your smartphone every year or 3, you can simply make hardware updates by taking off the easily removable back cover, unplugging the microchip camera or battery, plug in the new component, and Bob's your uncle. That way there is far less wastage, less shipping involved, and far less CO2 produced. These are obviously just a handful of suggestions. There are plenty of ways we can reduce global CO2 emissions with immediate effect, overnight, and without having to cripple our finances, buying items we do not need that will only just add to the growing CO2 emissions. We need governments to stop this madness, stop war, and bring sensible, non-invasive plans of action to the table. Thank you for watching. Please be sure to comment, share and subscribe. Until the next time.